going to try to get an early version, a beta of that available soon, hopefully in a month or so. But again, I promise a lot about schedules, and they usually don't happen, but I think actually, because I have the time now, this is actually going to happen. So, new to Grails 2.3, 2.4 is the Asset Pipeline plugin, family of plugins, which replaced the resources plugins, which themselves replaced my old UI performance plugin. So I don't go into any detail here, but you'll see the Asset Pipeline filter if you use Asset Pipeline plugin. That's going to be in the filter chain. That's where it hooks in to do the minification and the work that it does at runtime. This is a big one, the Grails web request. It's actually interesting, and I'm not going to spend hardly any time on this, but typically with a servlet-based application, everything goes to the servlet, and then from there, all the processing fans out from there, right? And that's how a Spring application usually works. But because of the way the Grails works with URL mappings, really the entry point for Grails is really the URL mapping filter, which is forwarded from here. So this is not the sort of the entry point into Grails. And in fact, what we'll see in a bit here, the URL mapping filter, when you get to a situation in Grails, hopefully you haven't seen this, and hopefully you never will, but every once in a while I've gotten to the point, to a state where it fails, your application fails so badly that you get a white browser, and there's nothing in the browser. There's not even any view source. You literally get nothing. And what's happening there is something's failing so early in the processing that it doesn't even send anything at all for a response. And when there's nothing there, where do you even start looking? How do you start fixing this problem? And it turns out, URL mapping filter is where it probably broke. Or from there, it wasn't very, very far from there. So no, this isn't really where you want to be. You'll get there eventually. So you go here, you go up to the URL mapping filter, then you get redirected or forwarded back here again. But the URL mapping filter is the key to fixing those really, really weird errors like that. And of course, here's the Spring security filter chain, which is uses a delegated filter proxy, which you should get familiar with if you're using Spring, because that's a really interesting thing, because the bean lifecycle is much more rich than the filter lifecycle. There's a lot more hooks, a lot more steps. So Spring very early on, had this concept of registering a filter, which is actually backed by, there's an actual filter implementation there, but it doesn't do any real work. What it does is it delegates to a Spring bean to do all the real work. So you hook into the servlet API very lightly, and then you use Spring, the full power of Spring. So there's a couple of different filters in the filter chain that use that delegated filter proxy. And that's again how it can be a filter that's comprised of other filters, because it's not a standard filter at all. It's a much more complex thing. And I should mention, I've got a lot of information here. I'm going to run short, I'm positive, but if anything's not clear, please ask questions. We'll have time at the end. But if something is confusing, please stop and ask questions. There's definitely plenty of time for clarifications. Okay, so here's just the Spring Security filter chain, and typically, of course, it's very configurable. You can add in different plugins. You can add in the OpenID plugin, LDAP, the Spring Security REST. So there are a lot of different configurations that you can have, but this is a fairly standard. If you use the sort of the standard out of the box DAO authentication, so you're authenticating to a database, your user and role information is stored in the database, and the sort of vanilla Spring Security. This is the I've worked with Grails code quite a lot, so I'm biased, but I like knowing how things work. Because when they fail, it makes it quicker to fix it. And even when it works, sometimes I'm like, why did that even work at all? So it's kind of cool to be able to get in there. So. And then another new plugin, new since this old talk, is the macaque plugins. So it's not a core thing at all. This isn't part of Grails. This is a default plugin that's installed by default. So that's some information on how to get into the caching filter. Okay, so the real information. So early on, you've got this security context resistance filter. This is very important because what it's going to do is it's going to populate, if you're already authenticated, it's going to retrieve your authentication from the session. It doesn't have to get it from the session. Almost everything that I say is default behavior. You do not have to use sessions. You do not have to use a database. You don't have to use domain classes. Everything's based on interfaces. Everything's very pluggable and configurable. This is the happy path. This is the standard stuff. So don't take this as the way that you do it. This is a standard way that you do this. So if you're already authenticated, we'll talk about how that even happens, but assuming you've already authenticated, when you come to a second page, you're still logged in. So where is that information stored? And it turns out that the authentication is stored in the session. And for every request, it retrieves that authentication and rebinds it into the thread local. So just like transactions and the current session, there's a lot of thread locals in Grails and in Spring, so that you don't have to, you always know how to get to this state. So this is your authentication state. So you don't have to deal with where it's stored and anything like that, because you just say Spring Security Service get current user, or there's a lot of different ways that you can conveniently work with this stuff. This is how it's implemented under the hood. So a very early filter repopulates the security context if you're previously authenticated. Early on, you don't want to do much processing if you're trying to log out, right? So you'd want to get the previous authentication, make sure that you are still logged in. But if you want to log out, you're going to post to that URL. You can configure that, but that's the default URL. So you'd want very early on to not waste a bunch of time doing other stuff if you just want to log out. So the logout chain happens here. So there's this mutable logout filter that I had to create because of the way that things work. And ordinarily, you wouldn't want to change this, but the way that the timing works, I needed to be mutable. So it's another chain here. So there are this concept of the logout handler. And I've got a sample application that I'm not going to do much with here, but I'll do a blog post. I'll upload the code, and so you guys can try this all out. And one of the things that I do, so I create a custom authentication and a custom filter, custom authentication provider, but also a custom logout processing. And the way that works is that you've got multiple logout handlers, and those are registered. There's a list of them, and they are invoked in order when you log out, and they do the work that they do. And we'll see some examples of those, but one of them, of course, is to validate your session, to remove the authentication from the security context, that sort of thing. All right, so the authentication processing filter is obviously an important one because that's the one that's going to actually authenticate you if you've submitted to, if you've used your auth form and you've put in your username and your password. This is where that gets processed. So it's going to see that there is the username and password available in the request. It's going to build up an authentication object. And then one thing I should mention is that Spring Security is split kind of in half. So there's the website and then there's the non-web side. So you don't have to use Spring Security in a web application. You can use Spring Security in a Swing app, in a client app. There's nothing about Spring Security that forces you to use web. In fact, there's the core jar and then there's the web jar. It's really an add-on. Most of the time, we're using this in a web context, but it doesn't have to work that way. And the non-web stuff is completely decoupled from the web stuff. So, very quickly, the way that authentication works is you build up this authentication object from the request. So you have these known parameters that are used, the J username and J password. You build up this authentication object, and the way I like to think about it is you throw it over the wall, right? So there's the barrier between the website and the non-web side. You throw it over the wall. The non-web side, the authenticator chain and all that sort of stuff, doesn't know where it came from. It doesn't know that it's a web authentication. It doesn't care because it says, I need to try to authenticate. I've got a username and password. Go to the database, go to LDAP, go to wherever you go to do that sort of stuff. If it works, throw it back over the wall, populated with extra information that was retrieved during authentication, like your roles, whatever extra information you have there. And if it doesn't work, if it fails, then you throw an exception, come back, and then on the website, then you'll show an error page or you'll redirect to something or whatever you need to do. So it's very, very separate. And that's where this work happens. And then one quick thing, I will put this in the documentation, but this is a bit of a break and change mostly for plugin developers, but also for users. I kind of piggybacked on top of the authentication filter to add in a request holder. So you can always have access to the request and response. And it turns out that in a few cases, that's too late in the chain. It's very early, but sometimes you want to have that available to you earlier than at this point. And so I've created, I haven't actually pushed this up to GitHub yet, but I've created a new filter, which is always going to be the first filter in the chain, which is going to be the holder for the request and response. So that's a small breaking change. I'll document that. So anonymous authentication. This is a kind of a cool concept. So when you're not authenticated, there's not going to be an authentication in the security context, and that's fine. So the way that you could do your work is you could say, if the authentication is null, do whatever. If it's not null, do whatever. But having to do with null checks makes things a little bit tedious. So they came up with the concept of the anonymous authentication. So if you're not authenticated and you've got this filter registered, it will, and this is registered by default, it'll create an authentication, which doesn't really mean anything. But you never have to worry about the authentication being null. It will never be null. It may not be valid in a way that allows you to actually do anything, but you can skip the null check. It's not a big deal, but it's kind of cool. One really frustrating thing with it, though, and I imagine most of you have probably have seen this, is that the principal object, which is the user details information, when you're authenticated, there's an interface called user details, and it's going to be in the plugin. It's this Grails user, right? So it's got the username, password, those booleans for whether you're enabled and your password's locked, and your list of your authorities, your roles. And then in the case of Grails, it's got the ID so that you can reload the original domain class instance, the user instance that populated everything. But if you're anonymous, it's a string. The principal is a string. So this is terrible because you've got to do you've traded null checks for instance of checks, which is worse. So one thing that I fixed for the plugin is that isn't the way that it works now. I've got my own anonymous authentication support. So if you're not logged in and you've enabled anonymous authentication, you'll have a principal, which again, can't do anything, but it's a real principal. It's the same class, so you don't do any instance objects. So it's not a string. It probably doesn't bother you as much as it bothers me, but this has been a thorn in my side, so I'm very happy that this is here. Okay, so if you've gotten this far, you must have authenticated, or been previously authenticated. So at this point, you're trying to get to a URL. And now we got to wonder, are you authorized? Because remember, there's those two big concepts in Spring Security. There's authentication and authorization. So authenticating is typically username and password. It could be a RSA number. It could be two-factor. Maybe you've got an app on your phone that has a digit that it creates. Whatever you have to do to authenticate, now you're logged in. But you may not be able to do anything at all. You may be able to do very few things. You may be able to do anything. But so you've got to ask for every request, for every page, can you see this page? So here's where we go to your roles. Here's where we go to the mappings that we set up for the rules for this controller, for this URL. You have to be role admin, or you have to be fully authenticated, which means that you can't have used a remember me cookie. You have to have fully logged in. All those rules, this is where that happens. So it's going to look at the requested URL. It's going to look at who you are, and it's going to build up this collection of security config objects. That's an interface. It's going to get that from the filter invocation security metadata source, which is one of Spring's 9,000 character long class names. And of course, if you use Spring Security in Grails, you know that there's 3 ways to define your rules. There's annotations, the request maps in the database, and then just a simple map. So those are the 3 implementations of that interface that provide that information to this filter to give you your list of roles and all the things that you can do. So that's where this all happens. So having built up the rules basically for what you can do, it's a little bit more complex than just yes or no. You've got voters. So and this is well documented in the Spring Security documentation, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with this, but it has this voting concept. So you can vote yes, you can vote no, and you can abstain. So if you vote no, then you're probably not going to get allowed in. if you vote yes, you probably will get allowed in, and then abstain is going to be kind of weird. So that's all very configurable. There's some default behavior, there's some custom behavior in the plugin, and that's where all that work happens. Vote. So for example, like the authenticated voter looks at those strange tokens, the is authenticated-folia. I never remember these. I always have to. It's part of why I created this slide, so that I could copy paste those from here. Because I always want to switch it. I want to say it's fully authenticated. Then there's the role hierarchy voter. There's a role voter, but then by default there's the concept of the role hierarchy, which is kind of a cool thing. So String security does not know what role admin means. It does not know that you meant that role admin means that you can do anything a user can do, and you can do anything that an admin can do. If you say, I have to be role admin to access this page, I have to be role user to access this page, if you don't do anything other than that, then an admin can't see the user page, because an admin isn't a user. Those are just, role admin is just 10 characters. It doesn't mean anything at all to String security that you have role admin or role user. Those are completely concepts that we apply to this. There's no meaning behind the roles. It's entirely defined by what you do. You say this URL requires these rules. Here's some things that satisfy that rule, that meshes. But beyond that, it doesn't care what they mean. So with a role hierarchy, you can set up a hierarchy of roles. You can say that if you are role admin, you inherit everything from role user. And then if you have a role super admin, then you inherit everything from role admin. So that way, you can set up the hierarchy very quickly and then say role user for this page. And now admins can see it, users can see it, and super admins can see it. That wouldn't make sense if, in a weird case, if there were a case where an admin can't see the page, but a user can. But you know, this is a very cool concept. And actually, there's a new feature that I'm not going to go into. There's no real slides for this, but a user contributed a huge amount of code for this concept of role groups, which is kind of cool. And I think I talked about this last year. But it kind of, I think the best use case for this is because right now I tend to think of roles as kind of very coarse, very high-level concepts. So role admin means you can do a lot of things, but I'm not going to have a lot of roles. But what you can do is you can kind of think of roles as permissions, and then you can group them together. So you can define roles for very, very fine little detail. So you can say, you know, you've got 50, 70, 100 roles that really mean permissions. You can group them together and you say, these 12 roles, or these permissions, form a role group, which is what I currently think of now as roles. So it allows you to kind of go a lot more fine-grained. So between the role hierarchy, which is kind of a basic thing, and the role groups, you've got a lot of flexibility there for keeping things simple or making things very complex. This web expression voter is a really cool thing because, going back a couple slides, I think these strings are awful. I can never remember them, but there's this Spring expression language that Spring Security uses and extends to add security concepts. And it's a little language. It looks kind of a little bit like Ruby. It's very basic. But it allows you to use basically a line of code that is interpreted at runtime, and then things get done based on that. So you can define expressions. So you can say has role parentheses role admin, and I find that much more readable than the alternatives. So this is where that work happens. And in addition, there's a new closure voter where to request for a feature where you could, you know, you've got the at secured, and that's where you put your role admin or whatever. You can put some expressions in there, but you can also now define you can put a closure in there, and that closure will run. And if it returns true, or Ruby true, then it succeeds. So that gives you a lot of power because you can run any arbitrary Ruby code you want inside of that closure. And instead of just saying that you have to be role admin or some expression, you can run whatever complex checks you need to do with Ruby code. So, of course, that'll bloat the size of the annotation quite a bit, but you get a lot of power that way, I think. So, Now, the example that I gave earlier was you authenticate and then you authorize, right? So I'm logged in, I'm perfectly valid, I'm a valid user of the system, but I don't have permission to see this page. So this is where that work happens. So in Spring Security, they kind of break that rule, which is I think an excellent rule, that says don't use exceptions for flow control. Because it's a go-to, go-tos are bad. But when you've got a complex system like this, where you've really got, like I was kind of describing before, you've got really a two-dimensional filter chain, right? So you can get pretty far into this, and coming back out of it could be really insanely complex. So rather than trying to figure out how are we going to have in hooks or some sort of a way of jumping around, use an exception. So this totally makes sense, and it's a slight violation of that rule, but rules are made to be broken. So this is where all that work happens. I'm going to skip the gory details of this because I think it's a little bit boring, but you've got a lot of class names and method names that you can use to put in there. This is something that you wanted to look at. All right, so the cool stuff, customizing the plugin. I think this is the big value proposition of the plugin. This is why I think it's important to create a Grails 3 version, a Spring Boot version of the Spring Security plugin. Is the customizability, I think, is really makes it a lot easier to use than traditional Spring Security. So how do we customize the plugin? So the sample app that I'm going to give you guys, and I'll show you a little bit of code. We'll do a few of these customizations. So we'll see in a second an example of the XML format that is used in traditional Spring Security to configure the rules. It uses namespaces, so you don't have a huge amount of XML like you did in the old CG 1.0 days. But it's very compact XML. But a lot of things are difficult to configure, and some things are impossible to configure within the XML that don't have support for it. So you actually have to use a Bean post-processor to make some of the changes you might have to do. So that was the real motivation for me to, instead of having a small configuration, if you look at the plugin file, the Spring Security Grails plugin.groovy, I think it's 2,000 lines of code. It's massive because I define every single bean. Nothing is automatic. And then every property, and I keep finding the ones that I forgot, but I'm trying to make sure that every property that you can set on a bean is exposed in the security config. So what I do is even for things that have default values, I reset them to their default values, and I expose that in setter so that you can change that with just a simple line of code in config.groovy if you just need to make some config changes. If you need to change classes, if you need to change how things work, of course you can redefine the beans. But redefining beans is relatively easy, and we'll see why, because of the way the Grails registers beans into the Spring application context. So, overriding beans. So this is intentionally hard to read. I mean, this isn't information here. This is just a list of a subset of the beans that get registered for you when you start up Spring Security. It's actually more than that. And this is an old list, so some of them might not be valid. But the takeaway from this slide is a whole lot of stuff gets done for you. And every one of those is explicitly defined. And they have names that make sense, I think. So if I want to change how the salt source bean works, or change how the token repository works, or the most common one is change the user detail service. I want to change where I get the information that defines if I have permission to authenticate. All I have to do is redefine this bean, and it's not a lot of work, it's trivial. You just do it in resources.groovy, we'll see exactly how to do that. So, very simplistically, when Grails is building up the application context, the core Grails plugins, they contribute their beans. And then your plugins run, typically after the Grails plugins do, but you can kind of change that around a little bit. And then at every step of the chain, if you find a bean with the same name as a previously defined bean, the old one goes away and yours wins. And the very last thing that happens is resources.groovy, so Grails app, conf, spring, resources.groovy, beans there are, can override any previously registered bean from a plugin or Grails itself. And that's awesome, because it just works. So the reason that works, and this is really way oversimplified, but you can kind of think of the application context as a map. It's just key value pairs, right? So there's the bean name and then the bean instance. And that really only makes sense for singleton beans, because of course there's the concept of prototype beans, where you get multiple instances. So I'm really kind of talking about singleton beans, and this is a very, very simplistic view. So what happens is when you define a bean, you register it into this map with the bean name as the key and the bean definition as the value. And then later on, you define it again. You essentially you don't do this, but it's essentially like calling map.put with the same key and a different value. So the old one just goes away. And that's basically how it works. But as I said, grossly oversimplified. This is not how it really works, but it's how you can kind of think of it working. So to change how a bean works, there's a few different approaches. You can take the class, you can extend it, unless it's final, and change the behavior. You can take a different class and subclass that. Everything in Spring Security is based on an interface. So when you're injecting that bean into your other beans, it's not injecting the implementation class, it's always injecting the interface. So you can just implement that interface. If extending it doesn't make sense, then just register it in resources.groovy, and there you go, yours wins. And this is what it looks like. So I've redefined the salt source, the user detail service, and the password encoder. And whatever those do, those are the ones that are going to be used now. And if 27 other beans get reference to the user detail service, they're going to get reference to yours, not the original one. So it just works. So that's redefining whole beans, entire bean definitions. But that can be overkill. So, like I said, I've tried to make sure that all the properties that can be set on beans are exposed in the security config, which you should never edit. But you just define the properties that correspond to those in config.groovy, and the new settings take effect. Because what happens is the default, what the plugin does, you might have seen this, but it loads in the default settings, it overlays on top of it config.groovy, and then that is what's used to populate all the beans. So if you set a property, the old values aren't there. And again, this is not meant to be read, but these are, again, a subset of the properties. I think that's actually too big, no. But yeah, I need a really small font to fit those. There's a bazillion properties that you can change. And again, that's a subset. It's a lot more than that now. It's probably 50% more than that. So here's some examples of just setting those. So you always say Grails plugin Spring Security dot, and then the actual property. There's a third thing that that you can do, because this can be let me step out of this thing. I want to show you something that I was working on earlier. So in the sample code that I have for the sample app, I redefined the authentication processing filter bean. So I'm doing exactly what I'm showing you in the slides, right? So I'm using the same bean name, my own class name, but then if this extends the, I've got to copy paste all those properties into it, usually, because I still need all those settings there. And that's kind of brittle, because if later on there's a new required property, then your code isn't going to work anymore. And for 2 of the 3 beans that I override, it turns out that the only thing I changed is the class name. Everything else has to stay the same. So the reason this was commented out is I registered and I'll describe this in the blog post, but I registered a bean factory post processor. And what it does is, it gets the bean definition that was built from Spring's from the Grails stuff and from the Spring Security stuff and from resources.groovy, and it just changes the class name that's going to be instantiated to define this bean. And so that is way more future-proofed, because if everything is the same except the class, but all the other settings are exactly the same, I just get the bean definition, change the class name, and then mine gets created, and then it works exactly the same way as doing all this junk, but without having to do that. I'll explain this better, I think, in the blog post. But so sometimes all you really need to do is you just need to change something simple in a bean that really isn't really a property. This is a dependency injection. So here I'm saying I'm dependency injecting into Bootstrap the authentication processing filter and a failure handler, my custom failure handler, and I'm just overriding this property. It's not a property that I can set up in config.groovy, because it's a class. So sometimes this approach is the way that you customize things. So. The most common customization, I think, out there, and this has a whole chapter in the documentation because of it, is creating your own custom user detail service. Because although the standard behavior is to use the database to store your users and your roles and all that information, you absolutely do not have to do that. You don't have to even have a database at all in your application. All Spring Security cares about is that you implement the interface and you give it an object that satisfies that interface. It doesn't care where you got the information. It doesn't care if you use random values, just as long as you satisfy that interface. So customizing that happens quite a bit, and I'll only go into a little bit of detail for that. So there's a link there for that section, chapter 10 in the documentation. So the workflow for creating a custom user detail service is to create a class that implements that interface. Well, there's a few different ways that you can do that. You can either extend the current implementation, which is the Grails core user detail service, right? It uses the domain classes to go to the database and build up all that stuff. That's very dynamic code because it's all property-based, so it's not a good idea to extend that. You can, but it's usually much more sensible to just implement the interface, because the interface has one method in it. And all you gotta do in there is just do the work that you do to get the user information and the passwords and the roles and all that stuff, and just do it. So you create your class, either by creating a whole new class or by extending something else. You may want a custom user details instance. You can use the one that the plugin uses, you can use the user class from Spring Security, or you can create your own. You can extend the Grails class, you can, as long as it implements that interface. That's all Spring Security cares about. So again, do what makes sense. Subclass or implement the interface. And then, just like we saw before, register it inside of resources.groovy, set whatever properties you need to set it there. And there you go. Now your user detail service is the user detail service. And when you authenticate, you will make a web service call to a microservice, a nano service, a pico service, something like that, to go to wherever and get the information. So, all right. So that's custom user detail service. So that's how you do that, but the user detail service is really coupled to the DAO authentication provider. So if you want to take over the entire authentication workflow, instead of changing the one subset of the standard authenticator, you want to completely redefine authentication. Probably makes more sense for a plugin, but you can certainly do this in an application. Step through the workflow for how you would do that. So again, it's the same workflow. You create a class that implements that interface, either subclass or extend or implement. You may want your own custom authentication class because again, if you're doing custom authentication, you may need extra information, you may need less information, things like that. So for example, authenticating through OAuth in Facebook or Twitter or something, you don't, there's no password in the database. So it would actually be less information. So whatever makes sense for your workflow, implement the interface, extend the class or implement it, and return that after a successful authentication. because of the way that, I was describing before, how you throw it over the wall, right? So you've got the web side and the non-web side. You probably need a web thing to provide the extra information that you need. And the example code that I do, instead of logging in with a username and password, we log in with an organization name and a user and a password. So that way you can reuse usernames within different groups in your company. So, so that way you have 3 bits of information. So you need a new login page, you need a new filter, you need a new authentication class to have that extra information. So this is all in the example code. And I'll describe that in the blog post. And then again, you register the classes in resources.ruby, and now you have redefined the workflow for authentication. And then I'll skip this because this will be in the blog post. But remember that we saw for the logout filter that there are the logout handler chain, which does whatever work makes sense for logging out. So that'll be kind of interesting to see an example of that. So there's all that stuff there. So we'll see how that works. So just as a kind of a high-level overview for making changes, here's the list of all the filters that you can change. You can remove filters. It's probably not a good idea. Be very careful if you remove functionality because you may take away something that's pretty important. You can add new filters. You can change the way that they work. You can add in new logout handlers. You can add in new voters. You can add in new authentication providers. Great. So yeah, and I had to change that last line because I don't know where you're asking for help anymore. You can ask on Stack Overflow, I guess, or something, but one thing we've definitely lost in Grails is the user mailing list was a good resource, and there's nothing really quite like it anymore. But all right, so buy my book. You guys already have a copy, so buy one for your mom. They make great stocking stuffers at Christmas time. There's a code here, OFF-E, will get you a discount. Gracias. Good also? For goodness, any questions? Okay, so I started to do that blog post. I will flesh out the examples. We have a few minutes, right? What I want to do real quickly is I want to show you some code. I made some changes in the domain classes that I think is kind of cool. So when you install a plugin, right? So you install it, you register it in build-config.ruby, and then you run the S2 quick start script, right? So that's the one that creates the user and the role domain class. So that I changed the way that these classes work. Well, I added some functionality. So role class is easy. It just has a one property. So they all have hash code and equals methods now, and 2 strings. This is something that I'm going to talk about in tomorrow's talk. Kind of cool. So typically in Ruby, we don't create constructors, right? So in Java and other programming languages, you usually create lots of constructors, or you create just a couple of them, and then you have this awful-looking stuff where you say like new thing, paren, user, comma, true, false, true, true, null, 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 5, right? And then who the hell knows what that means? So then you create 6 constructors with all the, so you don't have so many nulls, and they got to figure out what all the constructors mean. We don't do that in Ruby-based tasks. We just use the map constructor, right? It's so awesome. But there are times when you want a constructor, a parameterized constructor, especially when an object doesn't make sense unless these required values are set, right? So there's still value in constructors. It's just that you shouldn't have to use them unless you want to. So I was doing some playing with adding in constructors into the domain classes. And I'll talk about this in a lot more detail. And I can tell you now, I'm going to say this as a teaser, but this, I'm calling this in the constructor, but there's no empty constructor to call. So that's the question for tomorrow is why am I doing that and what does that do? So it turns out that I can still use the map constructor here, but I don't have to use it anymore. So creating a new user, so if you look at my Bootstrap, so forget about the find by, but this is how I create a new role. I don't say authority colon, and then to create a new user, enable defaults to true. So all you ever really typically need to set is username and password. So now I can just do that. So it's not a big deal at all, but it's kind of cool. And I discovered something really neat about how Grails works when I did this, because something broke that really surprised me. So I also changed the way that the user role class works. There's no load anymore, so it's all very dynamic. Makes a lot more sense. What else? Yeah, so here's the user class. Again, I'm calling this, I have to, because I don't want to break what I wrote. But I can still use an constructor. Now I can use this cool constructor also. So yeah, this isn't a big deal, but all these classes got quite a bit bigger and cooler. So yeah, I think that's it. That wasn't quite as exciting as I hoped to. All right, so see you guys tomorrow at the Little Did He Know talk. It's basically it's a bunch of small little things like that, and not constructor, and a bunch of funny little things, small topics that I thought were kind of cool. That and I'll explain why what the title of the talk means. Little did you know. So that will be a little less dry, I think, a little bit more funny, a little bit more interesting. So, all right, thank you.